Welcome friends to the course on Research Methodology in Education. In this video, we are going to talk about experimental designs. The learning objective of this video would be to understand the basics of doing experimental research in education, to give you a know-how of various types of experimental designs, to discern the strengths and limitations of various experimental designs, and you will be able to make an informed choice on the design based on its appropriateness with respect to the nature of the research. Let us first understand what are experimental designs. In experimental designs, we are concerned about the effect of one variable over the other, which means we want to check the effect of the independent variable over the dependent variable. The independent variable is manipulated through treatment and intervention, and its effect is seen on the dependent variable. It's like a cause and effect type relationship where the dependent and independent variables mingle together to give a cause-effect relationship, and we try to analyze the depth of this cause and effect relationship. It is perhaps the most scientific and objective process of doing research. We try to make a hypothesis, and then through our statistical data, we try to approve or disapprove the hypothesis, which means in experimental design, we rely on numbers and a lot of statistical analysis. Let us begin with a research example. Suppose I make a research problem. It could not be a very strong research problem, just for fun. Just think about that a researcher makes a hypothesis and she wants to investigate if drinking a hot mug of coffee before the quantitative research class improves the concentration of the scholars. Now, if she has to do this kind of a research, what do you think would be approach? If you were to do this research, what is the approach that you will adopt to look into this kind of a problem? One of the approach could be that when the scholars turn up for the quantitative research class, the researcher asks them whether they have had coffee before coming to the class or not. She identifies all the scholars who had a mug of coffee and who didn't. The concentration span period of both groups is measured subsequently, and the values are compared between the group that had coffee and the group that did not have coffee. The other approach could be that the scholars are asked not to drink coffee before coming to the class. And when they turn up, they are divided randomly into two groups. One group is given coffee prior to checking their concentration, and in the other group, they are not given coffee, or they are given something else which is called a placebo. Now, these are two ways from many which one could adopt to look at that research problem. I'm sure you would have done something else also, which is fine. But what we're trying to do is that both the approaches are correct. This is an experimental design which the researcher could adopt. One of these the researcher could adopt. And now we're going to look at how more similar research designs can be adopted for a study like this or similar studies like this. If you could think about in both the approaches, there are some limitations and there are some strengths. So the conclusion that we draw from this example is that one of the important skills of being a good experimenter is choosing an appropriate research design for your experiment, so that the story told by you is not open to multiple interpretations, which means you have to be a good designer. You have to think about your research problem, the nature of the research, what you want to analyze, how you want to analyze, what is the data available, what is the nature of the participants, what kind of variables are you dealing with, and then think about a research design. All designs are appropriate. It depends upon how rigorous can you go and what are your strengths and limitations while doing a research. Some key terms to be remembered before talking about experimental design. In an experimental design, you would have two groups, a control group and an experimental group. A control group is one in which the participants are not given intervention or any treatment. The experimental group, however, is the group on which we actually give the treatment or we do the intervention with this group. Primarily, there are two variables, a dependent variable and an independent variable. An independent variable is one in which the researcher can control or change. The dependent variable is one which is being tested and measured in the experiment. Any change in independent variable is assumed to have a direct effect on the dependent variable. Experimental designs can be categorized into three categories: a true experimental research design, a quasi-experimental research design, and a pre-experimental research design. We are going to talk about these categories and the subcategories in these categories subsequently. Let's begin with a true experimental research design. In a true experimental research design, the researcher has complete control over the variables. Therefore, predictions are made with complete confidence and the observed change can be attributed to the treatment given. There are three essential characteristics of a true experimental design. One, there is manipulation of variables. Two, there is a control group and an experimental group. And third, there is a rigorous process of randomization. Let's talk about this in detail. There is manipulation of variables, which means there is a conscious effort by the researcher to control the independent variable and see its effect on the dependent variable. There will be two groups in the true experimental research design, a control group and an experimental group. The control group is not given any intervention, whereas the experimental group will be the one on which the intervention or the treatment would be given. Utmost care is taken in a true experimental design to handle randomization, which means the selection or distribution of participants is done by following the principles of randomization. Now, this is a very important aspect in a true experimental design, and quite often people tend to ignore it. So, in a true experimental design, utmost care has to be given that when you're trying to make your control and an experimental group, you should follow a process of randomization. The more sophisticated the process of randomization is, you are likely to get better results. So one must take a lot of care in making these groups. There are three types of true experimental research designs in education. A post-control experimental design, a pre-test post-test experimental design, and a Solomon four-group design. The pre-test control design. As the word suggests itself, there are two groups which are made by a randomization process. There will be an experimental group and a control group. There is no post-test in these groups. Only the experimental group undergoes the intervention, and after the intervention, both the groups are tested on a post-test. So the conclusion is drawn by comparing the post-treatment scores of experimental and control group. In the pre-test post-test design, as the word suggests, again, there will be two groups, experimental group and control group. We would do a pre-test before doing the intervention. The pre-test would be administered to both control group as well as the experimental group. Only the experimental group undergoes the intervention, and effect of intervention is determined by comparing the post-tested scores of both the groups. Then there is another enhanced version which is called a Solomon four-group design. In this, the subjects are randomly selected and placed in four groups, two experimental groups and two control groups. One experimental and control group follows a pre-test design, and another experimental and control group receives a pre-test, post-test result design. So in a way, one can say that in a Solomon four-group design, there is an amalgamation of pre-test and pre-test, post-test research designs. So this strengthens the idea of doing research if a researcher has enough time and access to participants. This is the most sophisticated true experimental research design. So the advantages of a true experimental research design are that it is very powerful and it follows a scientific approach. It establishes a causal relationship between the variables with a very high degree of objectivity, and it offers a mode to control the extraneous variable to assess the role of intervention in a very, very neat sense. Let's come to quasi-experimental research designs. As the word itself suggests, quasi means partial, half or pseudo. Therefore, in a quasi-experimental research, one has some resemblance to the true experimental design, but it's not like the true experimental design. One of the three factors is compromised here. In a quasi-experimental design, the participants often are not assigned randomly to control group and an experimental group, which means quasi-experimental designs are good to use in settings where randomization is difficult to do. You may use these designs where your school administrators are unwilling to allow a random selection of students for experimental settings. Uh, Quite often in the educational world, we use two types of quasi-experimental research designs: the non-equivalent control group design and a time series. In a non-equivalent control group design, it's very similar to the pre-test, post-test true experimental design. The difference is in the making of groups. Actually, in a quasi-experimental non-equivalent control group designs, you do not follow a random procedure, or the random procedure of allocating a control group and an experimental group is compromised, which means the groups are not randomly divided, but care is taken to establish equivalence between the groups. Later, the experimental group receives the intervention and scores of both the groups on post-test are compared to see the effect of intervention. A time series design is chosen when the researcher wishes to analyze the effect of an intervention or a treatment over a long period of time. The researcher would continue to measure the effect of the intervention at regular intervals and a number of times over a period. Generally, there is a single subject or a single variable. These were the two quasi-experimental research design. Let's come to pre-experimental research design. These are the weakest research designs, and care must be taken. If possible, one should try to do at least a true experimental, and if not, at least a quasi-experimental. If both those designs are not possible, only then you should think about a pre-experimental research design. They are weakest. The researcher has very little control over controlling the variables. There are two types of pre-experimental research designs in education: a one-shot case design and a one-group pre-test, post-test design. In a one-shot case design, there is only one dependent group or variable. There is no control group, there is no random process of selection, and the study is carried out after some treatment which is presumed to cause change, making it a post-test study. So there is an experimental group, a treatment is given, and then a post-test is done. In a one-group pre-test post-test design, there is again only one group in which the treatment is administered, and the scores of pre-test and post-test are compared. Hope you benefit from this video, and you will now be able to think of a good research design which is appropriate to your study. Be an honest researcher and think about these research designs in a very careful way. Good day.